My Gavan and Melanin, thank you for having some Elvish tea with me. I decided to make this video about the exploration of the orc psyche and just trying to understand a little bit more about the orc. I have the letters of J.R.R. Tolkien to go through. He was a very wise man, and he's just so fair of a soul because the way that he describes the orcs, it makes complete sense to people that are able to really get in touch with kind of a unity consciousness and a love for all of their fellow beings. And what I realized was with my Palladian University of Wisdom, with the 10th dimension, there was no way that I would be able to actually really get to that place and really bring out what I was trying to really say about kind of the non-duality of this omniverse until I really explored some of the most terrible creatures and the kind of the archetype that sometimes people can take on and the roles that they take on in the world. So Tolkien met many orcs in his life, but this is all figuratively speaking, because there really is no such thing as an orc in the idea that not people on Earth are all evil or all good. And you learn that even his orcs were not completely all evil, but they were a symbolism for corruption and allowing themselves to kind of go down a really dark path. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to read through all of my notes here. I have about 12 places where I have found him mention orcs. And that will give you a little bit more of an understanding of what he saw when he wrote the orcs, and he actually described their characters in Lord of the Rings and in The Hobbit, and what he saw in the world of man, living here, and what he was really trying to say about orcs and what they really represent in mankind. I just want to say before I start, anybody who donates to my super chat, Han and Lay, and I just want you to know that I will plant trees in your honor, because that is one of my goals, is to use a lot of the money that I receive from Etsy and also from this channel is to help replant trees and rebuild our forests, because they are so needed on Earth. And I really feel that that is a good place to put my money. Okay, so let's begin here. So as I was saying, orcs have a type of symbolism to Tolkien. And just really quickly, J.R.R. Tolkien himself, he was a soldier in World War I. But his son, Christopher Tolkien, later on became a soldier in World War II. So when he is writing to his son, most of this is done going back and forth while his son is in the war or involved in World War II. And so he writes this. It's a letter to Christopher Tolkien, May 1944. So just right around the time where World War II is really gaining its traction. It says, I remember life in camp seems not to have changed at all. And what makes it so exasperating is the fact that all its worst features are unnecessary and due to human stupidity, which, as planners refuse to see, is always magnified indefinitely by organization. But England in 1917, 1918 was in a poor way, and it is a bit thicker that in a land of relative plenty, you should have such clinicians. And the taxpayers would like to know where all of the millions are going if the pick of their sons are so treated. However, it is, human beings, what they are, quite inevitable, and the only cure, short of universal conversion, is not to have wars, nor planning, nor organizations, nor regimentation. Your service is, of course, as anybody with any intelligence and ears and eyes know, a very bad one, living on the repute of a few gallant men, and you are probably in a particularly bad corner of it. But all big things planned in a big way feel like that to the toad under the harrow, though on a general view they do function and do their job, an ultimately evil job, for we are attempting to conquer Sauron with the ring, and we shall, it seems, succeed. And I believe he was talking about Hitler right there at that point, that he was representing Sauron, and so he's saying that, you know, America and the allies that are involved with really helping, you know, save the innocents in Germany at this time, he is really saying that, yeah, we're trying together to actually conquer Sauron. Same thing as he wrote in his Lord of the Rings story, which was really about World War I. But now he sees that it is returned again. And so I think that was very kind of prophetic about him, to understand how wars have a cycle, that they keep returning, because unless humans learn from their mistakes and they really elevate their consciousness, they're going to keep on fighting over the same things over again and again. And we shall, it seems, succeed. But the penalty is, as you will know, to breed new Saurons and slowly turn men and elves into orcs. Not that in real life things are as clear cut as in a story, and we started out with a great many orcs on our side. Well, there you are, a hobbit amongst the Uruk-hai. Keep up your hobbitry in heart, and think all stories feel like that when you are in them. You are inside a very great story. So he's basically saying, you know, have heart. Those who keep the value of, you know, love and friendship and honor, even when they're involved with wars. That's why we still can have good soldiers. When we have those people that really still believe in those values that really make a great character, they basically are involved in the wars, but they're not really part of it. They're not the makers of it. And so he sees his son as, you know, he must do what he has to do because it's a duty, but that war is a terrible thing and we should not even have it in the world. And then here he says, this is another letter to Christopher in 1944, so same year. And he explains a little bit more because he probably was using the symbolism of orcs a lot. And so he says, Uruk-hai is only a figure of speech. There are no genuine Uruks, and that is folk made bad by the intention of their maker, and not many who are so corrupted as to be irredeemable. Though I fear it must be admitted that there are human creatures that seem irredeemable short of a special miracle, and that there are probably abnormally many of such creatures in Deutschland and Nippon. But certainly these unhappy countries have no monopoly, and I have met them, or thought so, in England's green and pleasant land. So here I just put a note that orcs can be anyone and anywhere. He was not trying to pinpoint a particular group, because there are some Tolkien critics that really say that orcs kind of represented either the Nazi Party, or they represented, you know, even today in modern times, the Middle Easterns. They represent the Jews, even for people that, you know, are anti-Semitic in that kind of way. So Tolkien is really more fair than that, and he is not at all generalizing large groups of people, but he is saying that it's really about the individual that makes them actually an orc. And when they follow the crowd without using their critical thinking, and when they can go forward and do evil acts without questioning, and really, you know, just enjoy kind of destroying others, like a lot of the soldiers, part of the Nazi Party, well, then they are orcs. But he also will say, and I will get to it later on, that he wasn't trying to generalize and say all the communists were orcs or all the Nazi Party were orcs. It's just, it's about the individual. And you really have to go on a case-by-case basis and understand who each individual soldier or person was involved. And he says that it's not just those that were in, Deutschland and in Germany, but actually in England, he has met them. That they can look like anything and they can seem like they're prim and proper, but it really has to do with the heart and the types of intentions that they have. And we'll get more into that. Next one here is, he says, so this is another letter to Christopher, and this was in 1945, so 1 year later. I have just heard the news. Russians, 60 miles from Berlin. It does look as if something decisive might happen soon. The appalling destruction and misery of this war mount hourly. Destruction of what should be, indeed is, the commonwealth of Europe and the world. If mankind were not so besotted, wealth the loss of which will affect us all, victors or not, yet people gloat to hear of the endless lines, 40 miles long, of miserable refugees, women and children pouring west, dying on the way. There seems no bowels of mercy or compassion, no imagination left in this dark, diabolic hour, by which I do not mean that it may not at all in the present situation, mainly not solely created by Germany, be necessary and inevitable. But why gloat? We were supposed to have reached a stage of civilization in which it might still be necessary to execute a criminal, but not to gloat, or to hang his wife and child by him while the orc crowd hooted. So it's interesting that he says the orc crowd hooted. Once again, it's this idea of just kind of going along with the crowd and not using your own judgment and your own critical thinking. And it really is kind of following the illusions of others, because if you're following a crowd that is doing something wrong, well, they don't have the right judgment, and you're placing all of your trust in them. So it's always best to remain independent and really to always use your own type of, critical mind and really question yourself and really reflect before you act. The destruction of Germany, be it 100 times merited, is one of the most appalling world catastrophes. Well, you and I can do nothing about it. And what should be a measure of the amount of guilt that can justly be assumed to attach to any member of a country who is not a member of its actual government? Well, the first war of the machines seems to be drawing to its final and conclusive chapter, leaving, alas, everyone, the poor, many bereaved or maimed and millions dead, and only one thing triumphant, the machines. As the servants of the machines are becoming a privileged class, the machines are going to be enormously more powerful. What's their next move? So Tolkien very interestingly kind of says that the machines were really more of the war machines in his mind. He wasn't alive really at a time where he could see the internet, and so he couldn't see some of the good that was happening through technology, but that machines in their cold steel cell and being used as tanks and airplanes to drop bombs on people, he really referred to them as tools for destruction. And that in the wrong hands like this is where you get these terrible atrocities. And so I always found that really interesting. He himself was a very, very nature-oriented person. So, of course he would see the machines in that kind of way. And I understand where he's coming from. Okay, so here's what orc means. For those of you who are actually wondering, he says the orcs. The word is, as far as I'm concerned, actually derived from Old English, orc, demon, but only because of its phonetic suitability, are nowhere clearly stated to be of any particular origin. But since they are servants of the dark power, and later on Sauron, neither of whom could or would produce living things, they must be corruptions. They are not based on direct experience of mine, but, I suppose, a good deal to the goblin tradition. Goblin is used as a translation in The Hobbit, where orc only occurs once, I think, especially as it appears in George MacDonald, except for the soft feet, which I never believed in. The name has the form orc, in Sindarin and York in the Black Speech. The Black Speech was only used in Mordor. It only occurs in the Ring inscription, and a sentence uttered by the Orcs, a Baradir, and the word Nazgul. It was never used willingly by any other people. And consequently, even the names of places in Mordor are in English or Elvish. So we have Mordor, Black Land. Mordor is the Black Land. Mornanen is just the Elvish for Black Gate. And Moria is Black Chasm. And Morthon is Black Root. So he's saying that, Orc really derives from his understanding of the idea of the goblin, but it's kind of his own take on it. And he was writing, I think, a publisher at this point, trying to explain a little bit more about this Orc character, that it really derives from the old tales. And, it's something that we have seen in the world, but this is his own creation. And it's interesting that he said that, the dark power cannot create life itself, but it's more about corrupting the life that is created. Okay, so this one is where we get a little bit more into what orcs mean in the story and what importance it has with mankind. As for other points, I think I agree about the creation by evil. But you are more free with the word creation than I am. Treebird does not say that the Dark Lord created trolls and orcs. He says he made them in counterfeit of certain creatures pre-existing. There is, to me, a wide gulf between the two statements, so wide that Treebeard's statement could, in my world, have possibly been true. It is not true actually of the orcs, who are fundamentally a race of rational incarnate creatures, though horribly corrupted, if no more so than many men to be met today. Treebird is a character in my story, not me, and though he has a great memory and some earthly wisdom, he is not one of the wise, and there is quite a lot he does not know or understand. He does not know what wizards are or whence they came, though I do, even if exercising my sub-creator's right, I have thought it best in this tale to leave the question a mystery. So this is where he's saying, he's actually talking to Peter Hastings, and Peter Hastings was the manager of the Newman Bookshop, which is a Catholic bookshop in Oxford. And when you go into Tolkien's life, and I'm really excited about this biographical movie coming out on him, you learn that he was really criticized by the people that were really involved with the Catholic Church. And this man, Peter Hastings, who owned a Catholic bookshop, he was kind of questioning Tolkien. He's like, I don't know if I can keep this book in here because you make it seem like evil was created by another source. And he had to explain himself and really describe, well, no, it's not that Melkor or Sauron created the orcs or the dark things like the giant spiders. It's just that the darkness will corrupt and will mutate what has already been created. And so he had to explain that. And it's sad that he kind of had this life where he had to always be on the defense of himself, because he had people at that time really questioning his motives. And they were really asking him, well, is this something that's like an allegory, and is it representing the Catholic faith? And Tolkien had to tell them, quite honestly, I'm not really trying to represent the Catholic faith. This is really coming from my imagination, but I am putting forth the values and the kind of the central messages of my spirituality within there. And so you can see that when you really look at his story deeply, but it's not an allegory. And that's why a lot of people always really, had some problems with it, especially those who were involved with the Catholic Church. Now, this is interesting, and I was going to pretty much save this for another time because this talks about reincarnation. He kind of goes into a lot of different points here of kind of just defending his sense of spirituality, and I will do another video on that because I have a plan to talk about reincarnation and what Tolkien believed to help those that might be part of a faith today and their mind is starting to expand in awareness and they're starting to really kind of understand that, well, maybe I have lived before and there is such a thing as reincarnation. And so, I mean, I think science is really showing that about energy these days, and that, consciousness itself is energy. So we're starting to see more and more people who are religious starting to embrace the idea. And Tolkien was one of them. So I will go into that in another video. Okay, big question here. Are orcs redeemable? This is what Tolkien had to say. But if they fell as the Diabolus Morgoth did and started making things for himself to be their lord, these would then be, even if Morgoth broke the supreme ban against making other rational creatures like elves or men, they would be at least be real physical realities in the physical world. However evil they might prove, even mocking the children of God, they would be Morgoth's greatest sins, abuses of his highest privilege, and would be creatures begotten of sin and naturally bad. I nearly wrote irredeemably bad, but that would be going too far, because by accepting or tolerating their making necessary to their actual existence, even orcs would become part of the world, which is God's, and ultimately good. But whether they could have souls or spirits seems a different question. And since in my myth, at any rate, I do not conceive of the making of souls or spirits, things of an equal order is not an equal power to the Valar. As a possible delegation, I have represented at least the orcs as pre-existing real beings on whom the Dark Lord has exerted the fullness of his power in remodeling and corrupting them, not making them. That God would tolerate that seems no worse theology than the toleration of the calculated dehumanizing of men by tyrants that goes on today. There might be other makings all the same which were more like puppets filled only at a distance with their maker's mind and will, or ant-like operating under direction of a queen sentry. And I want to stop right there and talk about this. So in the movie, it's a little hard to see this because Peter Jackson chose to show almost like the orcs being born out of this kind of gooey, dirty substance. And so a lot of people believe that, oh, Sauron is actually creating the orcs, but the orcs were a type of goblin creature that were corrupted. So they started to become his servants and work in his army. And he is saying that this is exactly what happens to those soldiers who do terrible things in the name of war, and even to people that get involved with gangs and people that join terrorist organizations. They always start out as little innocent children, and they really are a product of their environment and of the type of consciousness that they allow themselves to have while they're going through life. And so they are a representation of the orcs. When somebody is born in this world as an innocent soul, or as at least a soul that comes from the same divine spark of consciousness that we all come from, but then somewhere in their life, they forget that inner light within themselves, and they really kind of focus on the 3D world around them and their environment, or they follow people that also have bad judgment and bad intention towards others. And this is really what corrupts people, because nobody in this world is actually born bad. There really is no such thing. And even though there are people that have gone into the courtroom, such as, I mean, I have seen it. I've read the letters from Jack the Ripper. I have read about the BTK Strangler, talking about the X Factor. They always suggest that, well, I was always evil and that I was doing the work of the devil. But that to me always comes off as like a self-defense. They're trying to defend the actions that they took. And when you strip away and you actually can go back into their life, and if you could scan their lifetime and see all the little events that made them who they are today, or well, they're not here anymore, but made them who they are by the time they get to be a murderer of other humans, you would understand what corrupted them. Where was the moment of their corruption? You know, when was it that they chose to hurt that animal to feel its pain and suffering? When was it the moment that they chose to bully other kids and smile at their pain? And when you go further and further into a soul like that, you start to see that it really is masking their own pain, that they suffered in some kind of way and they didn't really heal themselves, and instead they allowed anger and revenge and kind of a cold-heartedness to kind of mask their pain. And that is really why we have orc-like people in this world, or people who act like orcs. Nobody is really an orc, but they can act like orcs. You could choose to act like orcs. Same thing with elves, and same thing with men in Lord of the Rings. And I'll get more into that because Tolkien says that, you know, even elves can become orcs. It really is about an individual choice. And when you read the Silmarillion, you do see a bit of that type of behavior within the elves, that they are very capable of doing terrible things, such as the kinslaying and what happened when they killed, you know, their fellow elves. I mean, this is the thing, is that, you know, elves are not perfect either, and that they have to watch themselves in a lot of ways. So here he continues and he says, "Now, you will reasonably say, I am taking myself even more seriously than you did, and making a great song and orientation about a good tale, which admittedly owes its similitude to mere craft. It is so, but the things I have scribbled about arise in some form or another form. All writing or art that is not careful to dwell within the walls of obscure fact." So here he's just saying, well, my perceptions are the reality of the story. And really, he's not trying to say that it's fact or that it is connected in any way to the, you know, the allegorical myths of Christianity, but that this comes from some of his own experiences of, you know, of understanding, you know, what the orc is really about and how the orc becomes corrupted, rather than something that's actually made to be evil organically so. Because remember, everything comes from the mind of Eru, and yes, there was discord, but that was kind of a split part of him that represented Melkor. And that's where we get into the really interesting thing about the universe, is that yes, we are one, but there also is splits in psyches, because not all of the collective is aware of itself as one. So a lot within the collective are still acting out as individuals, as their egos, and they're not really connecting with the other parts of themselves, which is in other fellow beings. And once you do, that's when you decide to never hurt a soul. So this one is interesting. This one is a letter to Joanna, and this was dated April 1956. So he's trying to explain here. He's like, I am not a Democrat, only because humility and equality are spiritual principles corrupted by the attempt to mechanize and formalize them. So even though Democrats, he understands that they're supposed to, represent equality and kind of the humility principle and really, taking care of your fellow beings, it should never be he doesn't like organizations, as you can tell. So he's saying that it really shouldn't be formalized into a party, because that's when you get the division between people, because then you'll have one party who represents those values fighting with another, when you're really supposed to just represent those values and be a happy, peaceful person. That's kind of how I see Tolkien, being able to understand the world and why it was so funny to him. So he says, with the result that we get not universal smallness and humility, but universal greatness and pride, till some orc gets hold of a ring of power, and then we get and are getting slavery. So he is saying that anybody in history of mankind who has ever thought about enslaving another human being, whether it be sex trafficking, whether it be just slavery in general, that was done in America, all of the slave masters, all the slave drivers, everybody that has ever really embodied the idea of slavery and thought it was okay to use other fellow human beings, was saying that's an orc mind. To not see the value in another human being and to use them as an object, and really to be selfish and cruel like that. And so that was interesting. He said orcs represent slavery in this world. So, I mean, the people that are doing all of the terrible, the child trafficking, the sex trafficking, and the sex workers, and I mean, the people who run that, they may have grown up in this world as a little child, and they may have gone through the same experiences that we all have, but they have allowed themselves to become completely corrupted to be able to use their fellow human being in that way. And we really have to find a way to help them, so we can make sure that that doesn't exist in the future, that there's no such thing as human slavery in this world anymore in the future. That's my hope. Let me see what time it is here. Oh, good. I'm good on time here. Okay. Just a few more. So I like this a lot. He's writing to Herbert Shiro, who is asking him basically a question about what's the symbolism or the allegory in the story. And I am gathering that he asked, are orcs communists? Because 1957, we have that Communist Party starting to gain power. So he says, are orcs communists? And then this is what Tolkien had to say. He was such a fair soul in this idea. There is no symbolism or conscious allegory in my story. Allegory of the sort 5 wizards equals 5 senses is wholly foreign to my way of thinking. There were 5 wizards, and that is just a unique part of history. To ask if orcs are communists is to me as sensible as asking if communists are orcs. So I like this a lot. He didn't generalize groups of people together, but he was able to look at each individual. So you can't say that all those who believe in communism are orcs. You have to look at the individual for who they are. There's a lot of good people that may like something that's really unpopular with others, whether they're uninformed, whether they just have a different perspective. And that doesn't necessarily make them orcs. And he was really adamant about that. You cannot call groups of people, ethnicities or religions or political parties, as representing the orcs in his book. That was never his intention, and though people might take it to that place, it's not the truth. So there you go. I have seen comments on YouTube about how, especially in today's age, some people have said, well, the orcs in the movie, they're kind of dark skinned, and Peter Jackson had kind of that representation of them And he said that, there was a little bit of like this kind of Arabian influence from the people of the East that came over and, joined Sauron's army. And so people make that assumption that Tolkien was speaking about those of the Middle East. And no, he did not ever generalize groups of people. He really was somebody that if you met him, he would look at you for who you are as an individual and never place you in a whole group of people. But he did say that, there could be orc crowds because when groups of those individuals get together, so if you have many types of orc people getting together and they act like orcs together, well then, yes, it's called an orc crowd. Riots and those kinds of things where they just carry on to dramatic lengths, and you see it. It's so terrible in other parts of the world even, and in America, where they're just like looting on the streets and they're burning, flags, and they're stomping on things. And I know that they're trying to get their message across. They're upset, they're angry, they are, but there's a certain type of way that they should carry themselves so that they never really get to that place of where they're in those lower states of consciousness where they would act like orcs. And this one here is interesting. So here's the orc's true form. So somebody asked a question about, this was a letter to Forrest J. Ackerman, and it is Tolkien's comments on the film treatment of The Lord of the Rings in 1958. So he's breaking down some of his criticism on this film treatment here. And he says, why does Z put beaks and feathers on orcs? Orc is not a form of a bird. The orcs are definitely stated to be corruptions of the human form seen in elves and men. They are or were squat, broad, flat-nosed, sallow-skinned, with wide mouths and slant eyes. In fact, degraded and repulsive versions of the, to Europeans, least lovely Mongol types. So he's saying that they're as somebody might, they might say, oh, well, they might look Mongol with certain features. He's saying, no, this is completely opposite, that, Mongol people are lovely, and this is a repulsive version of a creature that really just kind of represents the elf and the man form. So, once again, don't generalize and don't kind of put words in Tolkien's mouth, I guess, which I like, because I like that idea there. Can elves turn into orcs? So here it is. So this is him with his letter, or is a draft of a continuation of the above letter that was not sent. He says this. So I suppose a difference between this myth, of what may be perhaps called Christian mythology is this. So he's showing in his letter that there's a difference between his story of Lord of the Rings and the myth of Christianity. Is that this? And also we can say Islam too, because Islam and Christianity and Judaism, they all have that same story about the fall. So here he explains, the fall or corruption, therefore, of all things in it and all inhabitants of it was a possibility, if not inevitable. Trees may go bad, as in the old forest. Elves may turn into orcs, and if this required the special perversion malice of Morgoth, still elves themselves could do evil deeds. Even the good Valar, as inhibited, the world could at least err, as the great Valar did in their dealings with the elves, or as the lesser of their kind, as the Ishtari or wizards, could in various ways become self-seeking. So he's saying that, yes, of course, elves can also turn into orcs, and they can also fall in that way when they do those evil deeds. And even the most I guess, blessed or highest being that you could think in Lord of the Rings could fall to the same level, that there really was no guarantee about the good of a character, but that it really relies in their choices that they make. I think Tolkien was all about the choices and the deeds that each character makes. And you see that with his idea about humans. And that's how I see it too, is that I will never judge someone without actually seeing their actions. And even then, I won't judge them, soul-wise, but I'll be able to read their energy and kind of understand where they are coming from and where all of this kind of bad action is coming from. And all you can do is have compassion for those. Okay, so here it says, are orcs heretical? So once again, Tolkien is basically accused of being a heretic, as all people are when they kind of stray from the organized version of the churches and the way that maybe a priest would see the Christian mythology. So Tolkien's being asked, and so he says this. So here he says, from a letter to W.H. Auden in May 1965, Auden had asked Tolkien if the notion of the orcs, an entire race that was irredeemably wicked, was not heretical. It's so sad that he was asked that. I mean, like, that's so bad that someone would say, are you a heretic against the church? And he's like, no, this is a fairy story. Please, this is about imagination and my creation, and but some people just don't get the big picture, and they focus on one little detail, and it just kind of it really, that person did not understand really what Tolkien was trying to say. So then Tolkien had to write a letter, and he had to explain himself. With regard to the Lord of the Rings, I cannot claim to be a sufficient theologian to say whether my notion of orcs is heretical or not. I don't feel under any obligation to make my story fit with formalized Christian theology, though I actually intended it to be consonant with Christian thought and belief, which is asserted somewhere, Book 5, page 190, where Frodo asserts that the orcs are not evil in origin. We believe that, I suppose, of all humankinds and sorts and breeds, though some appear, both as individuals and groups to be, by us at any rate, unredeemable. So he's saying that there's no such thing as any human soul, any orc soul in his story as being unredeemable, and that nothing is created completely through the energy of, darkness and evil and bad, that everything has always bits and parts of both good and evil. And it's really about the choices that you make, the wolf that you feed, that will bring you onto the path of really, altering your character and corrupting you, corrupting your soul, which is what Tolkien was basically trying to say. Although he didn't have souls in his story, he understands that about mankind. But once again, it's only temporary until somebody has some kind of spiritual realization within themselves, and they redeem themselves in some kind of way. And it has nothing to do with religion. You don't have to go to confession, although it can help because you can finally admit your problems and things that you do to sabotage your life or harm others. But religion is not needed. It really just comes to just self-reflection and not being afraid to take a look at the shadow side of yourself and really understanding why you do some of the things that you do. And to catch yourself in those moments when you scream at others or when you feel a need to, try to sabotage somebody's success. These are moments where you just have to pause and reflect and not allow yourself to become like an orc. And that's really the key. And so he said, orcs are not, it's not about being a heretic to the church. It's that He had a message that he wanted to bring forth through his imagination about how he viewed the real beliefs and, his understanding of Christianity. But it was not an allegory and was never meant to be taken that way. And lastly, so this is interesting. He talks a little bit about cults. So this is from a letter to F.R. Douglas Carter and June 1972, answering the question, did the Ents ever find the Ent wives? So this is a question that he answers, but then he starts to kind of go off, and I found where he talks a little bit about orcs too. As for the Ent wives, I do not know. I have written nothing beyond the first few years of the Fourth Age, except the beginning of a tale supposed to refer to the end of the reign of Eldaron, about 100 years after the death of Aragorn. Then I, of course, discovered that the king's peace would contain no tales worth recounting, and his wars would have little interest after the overthrow of Sauron. But that almost certainly a restlessness would appear about them, owing to the, it seems, inevitable boredom of men with the good. There would be secret societies practicing dark cults, and orc cults among adolescents. But I think it is plain that there would be for Ents no reunion in history, but Ents and their wives, being rational creatures, would find some earthly paradise until the end of this world, beyond which the wisdom neither of elves nor Ents could see. Though maybe they shared the hope of Aragorn that they were not bound forever to the circles of the world, and beyond them is more than memory. I like that. So he's basically saying that he has a belief in the afterlife, and he's showing that where the Entwives kind of disappeared into that realm, that other realm, which I talk a lot about on my channel, because I do believe that a lot of humans are ready to ascend, and their life will change in this lifetime, and you'll be preparing yourself for a new existence in the next. So that is the psyche of the orc. And now we know the secrets of Tolkien's mind, that he was never calling out a specific group. He was never trying to say that men are orcs, but that they can behave like orcs. And they certainly can act like that. But they certainly are never irredeemable. And that every orc will always have a chance to redeem themselves. And though he doesn't really show that side of them in his stories, you don't see that because it's part of the fairy tale. They have to play that role of evil. But in real life, talking about reality, Tolkien understood that every person on this earth, whatever bad that they have done in the past, they can always make up with it with new positive energy that they put forth and redeem themselves and transform themselves. And quite honestly, remember their higher self and act like it. And that really is what I believe that Tolkien was getting at about the orc psyche. And just a reminder to those that are hobbit-like and elfin-like and human-like, that it doesn't matter who you are, you can always fall to the level of where the orc is when you act out of selfish desire and you don't kind of temper yourself and really think a little bit before you act. And that a lot of times is what represents the reptilians in the collective mind. We always talk about the reptilians, but the reptilians also could be redeemable as well. It really depends on the individual. And that's something that the Pleiadians have known about. And it's something that I think people who are in touch with the higher dimensions of themselves understand, that all those who have done evil or have been part of producing more evil in this world, there's always a chance, there's always hope for them. And we must never give up on people. And that really is the key to attaining world peace, is bringing those people into remembrance of how much better they can be for their own sake, for their own peace, and for their own happiness. So, Hen and Lei for watching, and I will see you all on the next video.